6:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time this morning, the Canadian Embassy in Washington received a diplomatic note signed by the ambassadors of 39 countries expressing formal support for Canada's ultimatum to the United States and pledging coordinated action if the Trump administration fails to meet Canada's March 18th deadline by 9 a.m. That list had grown to 40 nations spanning every continent except Antarctica. The signatories include the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, all 27 European Union member states, Norway, Switzerland, Singapore, and multiple Latin American and African nations. This is not a symbolic gesture of diplomatic solidarity. This is 40 countries representing over 60% of global GDP and over 50% of global trade formally aligning themselves with Canada against the United States in the most significant coordinated challenge to American power since the founding of the United Nations. And the architect of this alliance, the person who built this coalition in less than 24 hours after delivering his ultimatum, is Mark Carney. The White House woke up this morning to discover that the United States is facing not just a dispute with Canada, but opposition from a global coalition that includes America's closest allies, largest trading partners, and most important, security partners. Trump never saw this coming, and now he faces a choice between capitulating to Canada's demands or fighting a trade and diplomatic war against half the world. In this breakdown, I'm going to walk you through how Carney assembled this 40-nation coalition in under 24 hours and what each bloc of countries committed to. I'm going to reveal the specific coordinated actions these nations will take if the US refuses Canada's ultimatum. I'm going to show you the White House reaction and why officials are describing this as the worst geopolitical isolation America has faced since the Revolutionary War. I'm going to explain why countries that depend heavily on US markets and US security are willing to risk American retaliation to support Canada. And I'm going to give you two scenarios for what happens when 40 nations move in coordinated opposition to the United States. Subscribe to join the community and share this video if it brought you value. Let me walk you through what the diplomatic note actually says, because the language establishes this as far more than rhetorical support. The note states, the undersigned nations express full support for the 5 requirements outlined by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney on March 4, 2026. We believe these requirements represent the minimum basis for restoring a functional partnership between the United States and Canada based on mutual respect and sovereign equality. We call on the United States to meet these requirements by the March 18th deadline. If the United States does not comply, the undersigned nations commit to the following coordinated measures in support of Canada. The note then outlines 4 specific actions that all 40 countries will implement simultaneously if the US misses the deadline. First, preferential trade access for Canada. All 40 nations commit to offering Canada enhanced trade terms, including reduced tariffs on Canadian goods, expedited customs processing, and priority access to their markets. This creates a global network where Canadian exporters have better access to foreign markets than American exporters do, fundamentally shifting competitive advantage away from the United States. Second, energy purchase commitments. The European nations, Japan, South Korea, and others commit to long-term purchase agreements for Canadian oil, natural gas, and electricity at premium prices. These commitments total over $180 billion annually, and provide Canada with guaranteed markets for energy that currently goes to the United States. Third, financial system support. All 40 nations agree to accept Canadian dollars in bilateral trade, to support the Canadian dollar through currency swap agreements, and to provide liquidity support if Canada faces any financial instability resulting from conflict with the United States. This essentially backs Canada's economy with the combined financial resources of 40 countries. Fourth, diplomatic isolation of the United States. All 40 nations commit to downgrading diplomatic engagement with Washington, postponing or cancelling bilateral summits, and coordinating positions in international organizations to oppose US initiatives until the dispute with Canada is resolved. Subscribe right now because what I'm about to show you is how Carney built this coalition and why countries across the world decided supporting Canada was in their strategic interest. According to diplomatic sources, Carney began making calls within minutes of finishing his parliamentary address yesterday. He didn't ask for support. He made a proposition. He told each leader that the U.S. Canada crisis represents a test case for whether democratic nations will tolerate economic coercion and violations of sovereignty by larger powers. He argued that if the United States can successfully coerce Canada, it can coerce any country. He offered each nation a choice: stand with Canada and establish the principle that sovereignty matters, or stay silent and accept that might makes right. Every country, he called, said yes. The European Union was first. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen reportedly told Carney that the EU has been concerned about US policy volatility for months, and that supporting Canada is an opportunity to demonstrate that Europe will defend rules-based international order, even when that means opposing the United States. The UK followed immediately. Prime Minister Keir Starmer reportedly said that Britain has already committed to Canada through the bilateral defence framework, and that expanding that commitment to include trade and diplomatic support is a natural extension. Japan and South Korea joined next. Both countries are US security allies, but both have expressed private frustration with Trump's transactional approach to alliances. Supporting Canada allows them to signal that they expect to be treated as partners, not subordinates. Australia and New Zealand joined as Commonwealth partners, standing with Canada. Latin American nations, including Mexico, Chile, and Brazil, joined because they face similar concerns about US economic pressure and see Canada's resistance as a model. African nations joined because many have experienced resource extraction by larger powers and view Canada's assertion of resource sovereignty as aligned with their interests. By midnight last night, Carney had commitments from 40 countries. By 6:47 a.m. this morning, the diplomatic note was delivered to Washington. Receipt number 1, the economic math. The 40 nations in this coalition represent approximately 58 trillion in combined GDP, compared to the US GDP of approximately 27 trillion. They represent over 50% of global trade. If these countries implement preferential trade terms for Canada and coordinate to reduce trade with the United States, the US faces immediate loss of export markets, higher import costs, and significant economic contraction. The US cannot replace 58 trillion in economic partnerships. The math doesn't work. Receipt number 2, the energy security shift. The energy purchase commitments from European and Asian nations total $180 billion annually, which exceeds the value of Canadian energy currently exported to the United States. Canada can redirect every barrel of oil, every cubic meter of gas, and every megawatt of electricity away from the US and still sell everything at premium prices. The US loses guaranteed energy supply. Canada gains diversified revenue streams and reduced dependence on any single buyer. Receipt number 3, the financial backing. Currency swap agreements from 40 nations mean that if the US attempts financial warfare against Canada, those 40 countries will provide liquidity to stabilize Canadian markets. Canada effectively has a $15 trillion financial backstop. The US cannot use financial pressure to force Canadian compliance, because Canada has more financial support from allies than the US can bring to bear in opposition. Receipt number 4, the diplomatic isolation reality. When 40 countries downgrade diplomatic engagement with the United States simultaneously, it affects everything. International climate negotiations stall because most participants won't engage seriously with the US trade discussions freeze. Security cooperation becomes difficult. The United States becomes a pariah in multilateral forums, not because of ideology, but because of how it treated Canada. And that isolation persists until the US changes course. Here's what happened in Washington when the diplomatic note arrived. At 7:30 a.m., the Secretary of State was briefed. According to sources, the Secretary immediately recognized the severity and convened an emergency meeting. By 8:15 a.m., the National Security Council was in session. The topic was simple. How does the United States respond to 40 nations coordinating against us? The consensus was that there is no good response. The US cannot retaliate against 40 countries simultaneously. The US cannot replace the trade, investment, and cooperation those countries provide. The US has been outmaneuvered diplomatically and has no tools to reverse it. At 9:30 a.m., Trump was briefed. According to sources, Trump was told that Canada has assembled a coalition of 40 nations and that these countries will implement coordinated economic measures. If the US doesn't meet Canada's demands by March 18th, Trump reportedly asked who the countries were and became increasingly agitated as the list was read. When told that the UK, France, Germany, Japan, and other close allies were on the list, Trump reportedly said this was impossible and that these countries wouldn't actually follow through. Advisors explained that the commitments are formal and that initial implementing actions have already begun in some countries. Trump reportedly asked what the US could do to break the coalition. The answer was that the only way to break it is to meet Canada's demands, because the coalition exists specifically to pressure the US into doing exactly that. At 11 House AM, the White House issued a statement. The statement said, "The United States is disappointed that some countries have chosen to interfere in a bilateral matter between the US and Canada. This coordinated action is unprecedented and inappropriate. The United States will not be pressured by foreign nations into accepting terms that undermine American sovereignty." The statement was defiant, but empty. It offered no counter-strategy. At 1 p.m., the State Department held a press briefing. The spokesperson was asked whether the administration recognized the seriousness of 40 nations aligning against the US. The spokesperson said the administration is reviewing the situation. That non-answer told reporters everything. The administration has no plan. Congressional reaction was immediate and panicked. Senator Mitch McConnell released a statement saying, "4 nations have joined together against the United States because of this administration's reckless policies. Is a national emergency. The president must accept Canada's terms immediately." Senator Chuck Schumer said, "We are watching the collapse of American global leadership in real time. The president has isolated us from our closest allies. This must end now." Even some Trump-loyal Republicans broke ranks. Senator Lindsey Graham said, "I support the president on most issues, but when 40 countries unite against us, we need to reconsider our approach." Let me give you 2 scenarios. Scenario 1. The forced capitulation. The economic and diplomatic pressure from 40 nations becomes unbearable. Markets continue falling. Energy prices spike. Business leaders demand action. By March 15th, 3 days before the deadline, Trump announces he will meet all 5 of Canada's demands. He frames it as a pragmatic decision, not a surrender. Canada accepts. The 40-nation coalition dissolves, but American global prestige is permanently damaged. The world has seen that coordinated opposition can force US policy changes. That lesson will be applied again. Scenario 2. The New World Order. Trump refuses to capitulate. March 18th arrives with no compliance. Canada implements all threatened measures. The 40 nations implement coordinated support for Canada and coordinated reduction of engagement with the US. Over 6 months, global trade patterns restructure around the US rather than through the US. The American order is replaced by a multipolar system where coalitions of mid-sized powers can operate independently of Washington. American influence declines to regional rather than global scope. This becomes permanent. I'm watching whether any of the 40 nations publicly confirms their participation in the coalition, whether Trump makes any statement indicating willingness to compromise, and whether markets react to the realization that the US is isolated. 40 nations united against Trump in less than 24 hours. Carney built an alliance that will either force American capitulation or end American global dominance. 13 days remain.